Imagine walking into the most dangerous room in Seoul, carrying the one secret that could shatter an empire. Serena Adebayo did exactly that. And the man who destroyed her life was standing 20 feet away. He looked right through her like she was nothing, like she had always been nothing. But then the little girl in her arms raised one small finger, pointed directly at the most feared crime boss in Korea, and said four words that stopped the entire ballroom cold. If you want to know what happened next, stay until the very end. And drop a like, then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation had been a mistake. Serena knew it the moment she pulled the ivory envelope from her mailbox 3 weeks earlier, the embossed gold lettering catching the late afternoon light above the restaurant her aunt ran on the ground floor of their building. The Choi Family Charitable Foundation Annual Gala. Black tie. Seoul Grand Intercontinental. The invitation had come through the hospital. She was still listed as a senior attending physician at Yonsei University Medical Center, still respected in those circles, still invited to the kinds of rooms where powerful people gathered to congratulate each other on their generosity while drinking wine that cost more than her monthly rent. She had almost thrown it away. Almost. Her Aunt Blessing had plucked it off the kitchen counter with 2 fingers and held it up like evidence. "You've been inside this apartment for 6 weekends straight," her aunt said, in the particular blend of Yoruba-accented Korean that still made Serena's chest ache with something she couldn't name. Amara needs to see her mother in a beautiful dress. Not scrubs. Not pajamas. A dress. Amara is 22 months old. She doesn't care what I wear. She will remember the energy. Aunt Blessing set the invitation back down with finality. "Go. Look powerful. Come home." So Serena went. She told herself it was for Amara. She told herself that the chances of him being there were remote. He moved in these circles, yes, but the charity circuit wasn't his primary territory. His empire ran through the financial underground of Seoul, through shell companies registered in Singapore and dummy corporations in Luxembourg, through backroom arrangements that turned legitimate businesses into laundering operations so elegant that prosecutors spent years chasing ghosts. He didn't typically show his face at foundation galas. She told herself all of this in the taxi on the way over, Amara strapped into the car seat beside her, wearing a cream-colored dress with small orange embroidered flowers that Aunt Blessing had stayed up 2 nights sewing by hand. She told herself everything was going to be fine. The ballroom proved her wrong the moment she stepped through the door. The Seoul Grand Intercontinental's main hall had been transformed into something out of a fever dream. Crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across every surface. The kind of warm gold that made everyone look younger and more beautiful than they actually were. Round tables draped in ivory linen. Centerpieces of white orchids and dark branches that must have cost a fortune per arrangement. A string quartet playing something classical near the far wall. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with a choreography so precise it felt rehearsed, which it probably had been. The room held maybe 400 people. Politicians. Corporate directors. Old family money and new tech money standing side by side, pretending they had always been equals. Serena recognized faces from medical conferences, from hospital donor boards, from the kind of news coverage that framed organized crime as legitimate business. This was the room where Seoul's real decisions got made. Not in the National Assembly, not in boardrooms. Here, over champagne glasses and forced laughter and the kind of conversation that never said what it actually meant. Serena had barely made it 6 steps inside when she saw him. Her body registered it before her mind did. A physical thing, a lurch in her chest like missing a stair in the dark. Her feet stopped moving. The crowd swirled around her and Amara's small warm weight shifted on her hip, the little girl twisting to look at something she'd spotted near the entrance, unconcerned with the way her mother had suddenly stopped breathing. Kang Jae-hyun stood near the center of the room. He was wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Serena's car, the kind of cut that moved with him like a second skin. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had spent 2 years systematically dismantling her memories of him, and this reconstruction was catching her off guard. His jaw was sharper, or maybe that was just the light. He had a glass of something amber in his hand, and he was listening to whatever the man beside him was saying with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that didn't interest him. Present enough to appear engaged, absent enough that you could feel the distance if you knew him. She knew him. She had known every angle of that face. She had loved every angle of that face. She turned to leave. She didn't make it 4 steps. Dr. Adebayo. The voice came from her left, not from him. One of the foundation staff, a young woman with a tablet and an earpiece, and the bright professional smile of someone who had been trained to recognize names on guest lists. Dr. Adebayo, we're so glad you could attend. Can I take a photo for the Foundation's donor acknowledgement feature? The flash went off before Serena could say no. And the flash, she realized later, was what drew his attention. She saw the moment it happened. Chae-hyun's gaze moved across the room the way it always had. Not scanning, exactly, but tracking. The way a man trained to read environments processes information without appearing to. It landed on the camera flash, moved to the source, found the woman in the deep burgundy dress with the small child on her hip. Found her. For exactly 2 seconds, nothing moved. Then his expression closed down like a door being shut. Not surprise, not guilt, not the complicated wreckage she might have hoped to see. Just a flat, clean erasure of whatever had briefly surfaced. He crossed the room. He moved through that crowd the way he moved through everything, with the unhurried certainty of someone who understood that space itself rearranged around him. People stepped aside without being asked. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A man who had been about to intercept him changed direction at the last moment, sensing something in the approach that made his instincts pull him clear. Serena stood her ground because there was nothing left to do. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. This close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. She could see the slight tension in his jaw. She could see him looking at her and looking, deliberately and pointedly, at everything except the child on her hip. Then he turned. Not to her, to the room. He turned to the room, raised his voice to precisely the pitch required to carry across a crowd of 400 people without appearing to shout, and said, "I don't know this woman." 6 words. 6 words and the entire ballroom contracted around her. She felt heads turning, felt the precise surgical quality of the humiliation. Not just the words, but the delivery, calm and total, and issued by a man whose authority in this room was absolute, so that his rejection wasn't just personal, it was a verdict, an announcement, a public ruling. Heat climbed up her throat. Amara had gone very still on her hip, the way toddlers sometimes do when they sense a shift in adult energy. They don't have the vocabulary to process. Her small hands gripped Serena's dress, her dark eyes, and they were his eyes. That particular shape, that particular depth, anyone with functional vision could see it, moved across the crowd, and then found the man standing 3 feet from her mother. She stared at him. She was not quite 2 years old. She had never seen him before. And yet, children at that age had no architecture of self-consciousness. No filter between recognition and declaration. No understanding that some truths were not meant to be spoken in rooms full of strangers. Amara raised one small hand, extended one small finger, and pointed directly at Kang Jae-hyun. "That's my daddy," she said. Her voice was clear. It carried. It carried the way only a child's voice can carry in a suddenly silent room, finding every corner, touching every ear. The ballroom stopped. Not metaphorically. Actually stopped. The string quartet trailed off note by note as the musicians registered the shift. Conversations died mid-syllable. The clink of glassware ceased. 400 people in their most expensive clothes stood perfectly still in a wash of chandelier light and held their breath. And Kang Jae-hyun, who had personally ordered the dismantlement of 3 rival criminal organizations, who had sat across from prosecutors and never flinched, who had been called the most dangerous man in Seoul by people who meant it as a compliment. He looked at the child, pointing at him. And for the first time in anyone's memory, he looked completely lost. Serena didn't let herself watch the full spectacle of it. She couldn't afford to. She turned on her heel, her burgundy dress sweeping the marble floor, and walked toward the exit with the specific controlled speed of someone choosing not to run. She made it to the side corridor before she heard footsteps behind her. "Serena." She didn't stop. "Serena, don't." She kept walking. Amara was twisting in her arms now, craning back to look at the man following them, the way she'd tracked a street cat once through a market. Open curiosity, no fear, no context for why fear might be warranted. "Don't say my name. Stop, please." The please was what did it. She had never once in 2 years of marriage heard him use that word. It landed wrong, foreign, like a phrase spoken in an accent he hadn't been trained in. She stopped. She turned. He was standing in the corridor alone. Someone on his security detail had sealed off the entrance behind him. Serena noticed. The kind of seamless environmental control that she had once taken for granted and now found quietly nauseating. He wasn't wearing his public face anymore. The version she'd watched dismiss her in the ballroom had been a performance, as everything with him ultimately was. This version was something else, something rawer and less composed, and she hated that she could still read the difference. His eyes had moved to Amara, not to Serena, to Amara. He was doing what she'd watched him avoid doing in the ballroom. He was actually looking at her daughter, looking at the shape of her face, the set of her nose, the eyes he'd tried not to see in a room full of witnesses. "How old?" he said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a normal register. "How old is she?" Jae-hyun. "How old?" Serena's jaw tightened. 22 months. She watched the math move across his face, watched him count backward the way people do when numbers carry consequences, watched the result land. She was... He stopped, pressed 2 fingers against the corner of his mouth, a gesture she remembered. He did it when he was holding something back that wanted to come out wrong. "You were already... I didn't know." Her voice came out flat and final. "I found out 6 days after you had me escorted out of our home. 6 days after your legal team hand-delivered the divorce papers with a 12-hour signing window. 6 days after you had my access codes revoked and my name removed from every shared account." She shifted Amara to her other hip. "I didn't know." The corridor felt very small suddenly. Amara had reached out and grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair, her attention drifting now to a painting on the wall, a large, abstract piece in blues and greens that apparently held more immediate interest than the drama unfolding around her. Children were like that. They anchored you to the absurdity of the present. "I believed," he started. "I know what you believed." Serena cut him off without raising her voice. "I know exactly what you believed, and I know exactly what you saw, and I know you had it verified 3 different ways before you moved. I'm not interested in your process, Jae-hyun. I lived through the outcome." His jaw worked. "The evidence was fabricated. I know. I've known since month 4. She watched something shift violently in his expression and kept going, because there was no point stopping now. "I had my own people looking into it while I was pregnant and alone and trying to figure out how to raise a child on a physician's salary without losing my mind. By the time I knew the full shape of what had been done to us, Amara was 3 months old and you had already... It didn't matter anymore. It matters. To you, now, because she said the word daddy in a room full of people." The cruelty of that landed. She saw it land. Good. She hadn't come here to protect him. But then Amara turned from the painting, apparently finished with it, and looked at the man standing in the corridor. Looked at him with the absolute, uncomplicated attention of a child deciding whether something is interesting. Then she held both hands out toward him in the universal gesture of a toddler who wants to be held by someone she has decided is available. Serena watched a man who had never in his adult life been destabilized by anything get absolutely undone by a 22-month-old's reaching hands. He didn't move. "She wants..." His voice had gone strange. "I can see what she wants." Serena made no move to redirect her daughter. This was not cruelty, she told herself. This was just the truth of the situation in its simplest form. "You don't have to." He reached out and took the child. It was clumsy in the specific way of someone who hadn't held a small person before, the brief uncertainty about where hands went, the slight alarm when Amara immediately grabbed his lapel and leaned back to study his face from very close range with the focus of a scientist examining a specimen. Then some adjustment happened, something physical and instinctive, and Jae-hyun had a hand under her and an arm supporting her back, and Amara was apparently satisfied with the structural arrangement, because she patted his cheek once with an open hand and looked at Serena as if to say, "Yes, this works, this is acceptable." Serena's chest did something she did not permit herself to name. "I need to go," she said. "We need to talk." "Not tonight." "Serena." "Not tonight." She reached out and took her daughter back with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this alone for 22 months, resettled Amara on her hip, and looked at him squarely. You want access to her life? You go through a lawyer. You make a request like a person. You do not show up at my home. You do not contact my workplace. You do not use any of the methods you actually have available to you, because if you do, I will disappear somewhere you cannot find either of us. Are we clear? She said. His nostrils flared. He did not like being given terms. He had never in his life been given terms by someone who genuinely expected him to honor them. Clear, he said. Good. She walked out. She walked back through the hotel lobby and out the revolving door and stood in the cold soul night air for 3 full minutes, Amara's head resting on her shoulder. The little girl already drowsy and unconcerned, while Serena's heart attempted to remember its normal rhythm. The taxi came. They went home. It was not until she was putting Amara down in her crib in the small second bedroom of their apartment above Aunt Blessing's restaurant that Serena let herself feel any of it. Even then, she didn't cry. She sat on the edge of Amara's bed in her burgundy dress and listened to her daughter breathe, that even, weightless rhythm, and she thought about the look on his face when Amara reached for him. She thought about the math he'd done in the corridor. She thought about the word he'd used, please. In the ballroom, on the other side of those walls, Kang Jae-hyun was still standing in a room full of people who were pretending not to calculate what they'd witnessed. His strategist, Dae Seok-han, would be at his elbow within minutes. The whisper network of Seoul's elite social structure was already moving, she knew. That moment would be dissected over breakfast tables and in private messaging threads for weeks. The feared kingpin. The woman he'd publicly disowned. The child who called him daddy. The story wrote itself and everyone would have their own version of it. Serena's version was the one that actually happened. And in her version, the most dangerous man in Seoul had held her daughter for approximately 45 seconds and looked like he was holding the only evidence of something he hadn't known he'd lost. She should have found that satisfying. She didn't. She found it deeply, uselessly complicated, and she resented every second of that complication. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. At 7 the next morning, a message arrived from an attorney she'd never heard of. The message was 3 sentences. His client wished to establish paternity formally and begin supervised visitation discussions. His client understood that this would proceed entirely on terms agreeable to Dr. Adebayo. His client requested only the opportunity to be present in his daughter's life. Serena read it twice. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen counter and poured herself coffee and stared out the window at the street below, where the neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. The woman from the second floor walking her dog, the delivery truck idling outside the bakery across the street, a vendor arranging produce in careful rows on a cart. Ordinary life. Good life. The life she'd built from what he'd left her with. She picked up the phone. She called her own lawyer. Because whatever happened next, she was not going to be unrepresented. She was not going to be caught off guard. She was not going to stand in a corridor with Amara on her hip and feel the ground shift under her without having something solid to stand on. She had made that mistake once. She wasn't built to make it twice. 3 days later, they sat across a conference table from each other for the first time in 2 years. 2 lawyers arranged on each side. A court-appointed family mediator at the head of the table. Fluorescent lights and paper cups of water and the particular antiseptic neutrality of a room designed to drain drama out of high-conflict situations. Jae-hyun looked like he hadn't slept either. Serena noticed this and filed it away and said nothing about it. The lawyers talked. This was how these things worked. You paid people to say the things you couldn't say directly, to translate raw human wreckage into procedural language. Visitation schedules, paternity confirmation, financial support framework. The mediator took notes. The lawyers negotiated around the edges of things. Jae-hyun and Serena did not speak to each other directly for the first 40 minutes. Then his lawyer said something about the proposed initial visitation period, 2 hours, twice monthly, supervised location, and Jae-hyun set his pen down on the table. "That's not enough," he said. "Mr. Kang," his lawyer started. "That's not enough time." He wasn't looking at his lawyer. He was looking at Serena. 2 hours twice a month. She'll be 3 before I know what she sounds like when she laughs. Serena's lawyer leaned in. "The current proposal reflects—" "I understand the proposal. I'm talking to Dr. Adebayo." The room got quiet. Serena looked at him, at the man who had spent 28 years building an empire on the principle that his word was final. His judgment was absolute, and anyone who challenged either was either corrected or removed. He was sitting in a fluorescent-lit mediation room asking her for more time with a child he hadn't known existed until 5 days ago. 2 hours is where we start, she said. You demonstrate you're consistent. You demonstrate you're not going to make promises to her and then disappear when something more important comes up. Then we talk about more time. Nothing is more important. You said that about a lot of things. She kept her voice even. Build the record. Then we'll have this conversation again. His jaw tightened. He picked up the pen. He signed where his lawyer indicated. The mediation concluded 40 minutes later. They filed out of the conference room in the careful single file of people who have nothing left to perform for each other. In the elevator lobby, the lawyers drifted into their respective phone calls, and the mediator headed for the stairwell, and for exactly 11 seconds, Serena and Jae-hyun were standing in the same space without a table between them. The birthmark, he said. His voice was low, private. On her left shoulder. Serena went still. My grandfather had it. My father. I have it. He paused. I saw it. In the corridor. When you were carrying her and her dress strap slipped. The Kong family birthmark, a small port wine stain shaped roughly like a crescent, high on the shoulder, passed through generations on the paternal line. She had noticed it when Amara was 4 days old in the hospital, in the 3 a.m. darkness of a room where she was the only adult. She had pressed her fingers very gently against it and understood exactly what it meant and cried until she had nothing left. I know, she said. No DNA test will... I know that too. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he used to before he started believing things about her that weren't true. Before whoever had put the evidence in front of him had done their work so thoroughly that he'd chosen the documents over the woman he'd promised to protect. I'm sorry, he said. 2 years of nights alone. 2 years of building something from nothing. 2 years of Amara's face as she slept, carrying the features of a man who didn't know she existed. I know, Serena said. She got on the elevator. She went back to her life. But that night, after Aunt Blessing had taken Amara for the evening and the apartment was quiet for the first time in what felt like months, Serena sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she didn't drink and thought about what Dae-seok Han had apparently found. She knew because Han had sent a separate message through her lawyer. Unofficial. Off record. 3 paragraphs detailing what the investigation into the original evidence had uncovered, or rather, who had constructed it. Chairman Kwon Seung-tae, Senior Advisor. Longtime power behind a significant portion of Jae-hyun's financial operations. The man who had sat across from them at dinners. The man who had given a toast at their private wedding ceremony. The man who had apparently spent months engineering her destruction with the specific goal of steering Jae-hyun toward a politically advantageous remarriage to a woman from a family whose connections Kwon needed. She'd been eliminated like a business problem. She turned the glass on the table without picking it up, around and around on the wood surface. 2 years ago, she had been a 31-year-old woman who had just signed divorce papers she didn't understand, carrying a pregnancy she didn't know about, trying to figure out how her marriage had ended so completely and so fast that she still felt phantom warmth in the space beside her in bed. Now she was sitting in her own kitchen, in her own life, with a daughter who owned her entire heart, and the man who'd broken everything was sitting somewhere in this city trying to figure out how to be a father. And Chairman Kwon Seung-tae was still in his position, still operational, still advising, still, as far as she knew, unpunished. Her hand tightened on the glass. There were things Jae-hyun had said in the mediation room that she was still processing. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The particular quality of a man beginning to understand the full dimensions of what had been taken from him. And from her. And from a child who had reached for him in a hotel corridor like she knew something neither of her parents had been willing to say out loud. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from an unknown number. No name, no context. Just, Chairman Kwon knows about the mediation. He knows you've spoken. He is not going to allow what you both know to become a problem for him. Serena stared at the message for a long moment. She screenshot it. She sent it to her lawyer. Then she put the phone on the table and looked at the kitchen ceiling and thought, for the first time since the gala, that this situation was considerably more dangerous than a custody arrangement and a complicated history. Somewhere in this city, the man who had fabricated her destruction knew she was back in Jae-hyun's orbit, and he was already moving. The message sat on Serena's phone screen for 3 days before anything happened, not because she was ignoring it, because she was watching. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way. The difference between paralysis and patience, between someone who froze and someone who waited with their eyes open. She went to work. She did her rounds at Yonsei. She came home. She fed Amara, bathed her, read her the same board book about a small bear finding his way home that Amara demanded every single night with the specific tyranny of toddlers who had found something they loved. She put her daughter to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table and she watched the walls. On the 4th day, her lawyer called. "The number traces to a burner," Minji said without preamble. She was that kind of lawyer. No pleasantries, no softening, which was exactly why Serena had hired her. Purchased with cash at a convenience store in Mapogu 6 weeks ago. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. 6 weeks ago, Serena said, before the gala. A pause. Yes, so someone had been watching her before the ballroom, before Amara pointed at her father in front of 400 witnesses. Someone had prepared the infrastructure of a warning in advance, which meant they had anticipated this collision and had decided in advance that Serena needed to be managed. "Can you forward it to Jae-hyun's team?" Serena asked. Another pause. Longer. "You want me to share evidence with opposing counsel?" "He's not opposing anymore. It's complicated. Forward it. His strategist, Han Dae-seok. He'll know what to do with it." Minji didn't argue. She was paid not to argue when Serena used that particular tone. The call ended and Serena looked out the window at the street below and thought about Chairman Kwon Seong-tae's face. The specific way he smiled, wide and warm, and so thoroughly constructed that you never caught the machinery behind it. She had sat at his dinner table. She had accepted his congratulations on her marriage. She had thanked him, once, for a gift he'd sent when she and Jae-hyun returned from a brief trip to Jeju. He had been building her demolition the entire time. She picked up Amara's jacket from the chair where she'd left it and folded it very carefully, crease over crease, because she needed something to do with her hands. The first supervised visit happened on a Tuesday. The Family Mediation Center had a specific room for it. Neutral colors, low furniture sized for children, a basket of toys in the corner that were rotated weekly to prevent attachment to objects that belonged to the facility rather than to anyone's actual life. A supervisor sat near the window with a tablet, logging timestamps and observations in the detached clinical shorthand of someone paid to be invisible. Jae-hyun arrived 4 minutes early. Serena noted this because she had expected him to be late. Powerful men were late as a matter of practice. It was a dominance mechanism so embedded in their behavior that most of them didn't recognize they were doing it. He was not late. He was 4 minutes early, and he was wearing dark slacks and a simple charcoal sweater instead of a suit, which told her someone had advised him on how to present himself in a supervised visitation context. Probably Han. Amara walked into the room ahead of Serena, because that was how it worked with Amara. She entered spaces first and assessed them and decided their value. And this room had a basket of toys, so its value was immediately high. She went directly to the basket and began excavating. Jae-hyun looked at his daughter. He looked at her the way Serena had watched him look at things he was trying to understand, with a focused, effortful attention that was almost uncomfortable to observe, like he was trying to read structural plans for something he'd never built before. "Hi," he said. Amara did not look up from the basket. She had found a small rubber giraffe and was examining its ears with complete seriousness. "Her name," he said quietly to Serena. "Amara. You chose it." "It means grace in Igbo." Serena kept her voice neutral. "My grandmother's name." Something moved through his expression. Not quite pain. Something adjacent to it. "She doesn't know who I am." "She knows you're the man from the hotel. She talked about you for 2 days after." Serena paused. "She called you the tall man with the serious face." The corner of his mouth did something that almost became a smile and then reconsidered. He sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. On the floor, in his expensive charcoal sweater, cross-legged on the activity mat at Amara's level. Serena watched the supervisor make a note. She watched Amara glance up from the giraffe, assess this development, and scoot approximately 6 inches closer to him without making any acknowledgement that she'd done so. The hour passed in a way Serena hadn't prepared for. She had prepared for conflict, for Amara's suspicion, for the cold management of proximity, for the careful maintenance of distance, while a man who had no practice with children tried to navigate a space designed for them. She had not prepared for her daughter to climb into Jae-hyun's lap 20 minutes into the visit with the casualness of someone taking a seat on familiar furniture, or for him to go completely still in the way of a person who doesn't trust themselves to move and break something. He sat there with Amara in his lap and a picture book she'd handed him open to a page about a frog and a pond, and he read it, haltingly, mispronouncing one word and then correcting himself when Amara looked up at him with patient expectation. Serena stood near the door and felt something move through her chest that she absolutely did not want to feel. She left before the visit ended. The supervisor's protocol permitted it. She went to the coffee shop 2 buildings over and sat with an Americano she didn't taste and stared at a fixed point on the wall for 50 minutes. And when she came back, Jae-hyun was standing in the corridor outside the room with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had just survived something. "She fell asleep," he said, "on my arm for 11 minutes. She does that. I didn't move." He said it like a confession. "For 11 minutes I didn't move." Serena looked at him for a moment. "Same time Thursday?" He nodded. She went back in and got her daughter. It was 3 weeks after the first visit, on a Thursday evening when Amara was at Aunt Blessing's and Serena was finishing a 12-hour shift at Yonsei, that Han Dae-suk appeared in the hospital corridor. She recognized him immediately. She had met him twice during her marriage, brief encounters in the orbit of Jae-hyun's professional world. He was a compact man, early 40s, with the particular kind of stillness that came from years of operating in spaces where movement had consequences. He was standing outside the staff exit with no expression and a manila envelope. "Dr. Adebayo?" He held out the envelope. She didn't take it. "You couldn't send this through my lawyer. Some things shouldn't travel through channels." He kept his arm extended, patient. "Mr. Kang doesn't know I'm here." That got her attention. She took the envelope. Inside were photographs. Surveillance quality, grainy in the specific way of long lens work, but clear enough. Chairman Kwon Seong-tae at a restaurant in Gangnam, across from a man she didn't recognize. The third photograph was a blown-up section of the second. On the table between them, partially visible beneath a folded jacket, was what appeared to be a phone displaying a photograph of Serena. "When was this taken?" she asked. 9 days ago." Han paused. "The man across from him is an operative, freelance. He has done work for 3 separate organizations in the past 4 years. His specialty is—" He stopped, chose the next word carefully. "Pressure." Serena looked at the photograph for a long moment. The cold of the hospital corridor was specific and institutional, and she was very aware of it against the back of her neck. "He's escalating," she said. "He's afraid." Han said it with the flatness of a man reporting weather. The gala changed the calculation. Before, you were a removed variable. Now you're back in proximity to Mr. Kang, and there is a child who carries the Kang name. Chairman Kwon's arrangement, the remarriage he engineered to consolidate the Yoon family alliance, it depends on Mr. Kang remaining without an heir from a prior relationship. Amara destabilizes his entire plan. Amara's existence, yes, and your willingness to pursue legal recognition of her paternity. He paused again. He will not wait long. Serena slid the photographs back into the envelope. Her hands were very steady, and she was simultaneously grateful for that and aware that the steadiness was a physiological response to threat, the same mechanism that let surgeons operate through chaos, and that underneath it something was moving very fast and very cold. "What does Jae-hyun know?" she asked. "He knows Kwon fabricated the evidence. He has known for 11 days. He is processing that information." "Processing," she repeated the word without inflection. "He hasn't moved against Kwon yet." Han's voice was carefully neutral. "Which concerns me. Why would that concern you?" "Because it means he's thinking about it." Han looked at her directly. "And when Mr. Kang thinks about something for more than a week without acting, it means he's decided the action needs to be total. Serena understood what that meant. She had been married to the man for 4 years. She understood exactly what that meant. And she understood why Han was standing outside a hospital at 8:30 in the evening telling her things Jae-hyun didn't know he was telling her. "You're warning me," she said. "I'm informing you." A precise distinction. What you do with the information is your decision. He left. She stood in the cold corridor with the envelope and the particular sensation of a floor that had seemed solid, revealing the depth of what was beneath it. She called Jae-hyun. He answered on the second ring. "Han talked to you," he said immediately. Not a question. Han gave me photographs of Kwon meeting with someone who apparently specializes in making people's problems go away. She kept walking now, down the corridor, through the side door, into the parking structure where her voice would carry less. "Are you going to tell me you have it handled?" "I have it." "Jae-hyun." She stopped walking. "Your daughter is 22 months old, and she has been in a supervised visitation room with you 3 times. And there is a man who already destroyed my life once, who is now apparently paying someone to apply pressure to a situation involving my child." Her voice was flat and controlled, and the flatness cost her something she didn't want to calculate. "Do not tell me you have it handled." A long silence. "I need 2 days," he said. "For what?" "To do this correctly." Another pause. The particular quality of it. She recognized it. He was in a room with other people and choosing what to say. Kwon has been with the organization for 19 years. He has protected relationships, internal alliances, men who owe him. If I move wrong, he uses those relationships to create enough chaos that the situation becomes, "I don't care about your internal politics." If Kwon creates enough chaos internally, the external threat to you and Amara becomes exponentially harder to manage. The operatives he uses are contractors. If his direction disappears, the contracts don't automatically terminate. His voice had dropped. "I need to dismantle the structure, not just remove the figure at the top. That takes 2 days." Serena stood in the parking structure in her scrubs with the manila envelope under her arm and thought about her daughter asleep at Aunt Blessing's apartment, probably taking up the exact center of the bed the way she always did, one arm thrown out, completely certain of her safety in the way of children who have never had reason to doubt it. 2 days, she said. "I'll have a security detail on your building tonight. Plain clothes. You won't see them. I don't want—" "Serena." His voice came through the phone with a weight she felt in her sternum. "Let me do this one thing." She didn't answer right away. The parking structure was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic filtering through the concrete levels. A fluorescent tube above her head flickered twice and steadied. "One thing," she said, "and we talk about Kwon's consequences. Together, before you decide anything." Another silence. This one different in texture. She could feel him calculating. Feeling the unusual shape of being asked to share a decision he would typically make alone. "Together," he said finally. She hung up. The detail appeared that night. She spotted one of them near the convenience store across the street. The specific quality of a person trying to look purposeless while remaining extremely purposeful. She didn't acknowledge it. She went upstairs and brought Amara home from Aunt Blessing's and put her to bed and sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, thinking about what together had cost him to say. The 2 days passed in a specific kind of suspended tension that Serena had no good vocabulary for. She worked. She parented. She slept in 3-hour blocks and woke to check on Amara and stood at the window watching the street below with the envelope on the kitchen counter where she could always see it. On the second evening, Jae-hyun came to her door. Not a call. Not a message. Through lawyers. He knocked on the door of her apartment above her aunt's restaurant at 7 in the evening, and when she opened it, he was standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man who had done several things in the past 48 hours that he was carrying with him. She stepped back. Let him in. He stood in her kitchen, her actual kitchen, with Amara's drawings on the refrigerator and the pot of Aunt Blessing's egusi soup still warm on the stove and the small accumulated evidence of a life built from wreckage. And he looked at all of it and said nothing for a moment. "Kwon has been suspended from all operational roles," he said finally, "pending a full internal audit. His protected relationships have been addressed. The contractor he hired has been intercepted and paid to terminate the arrangement." He paused. "He will not be a problem." "Suspended," Serena said carefully. "Not removed." Not yet. His jaw was tight. There are legal mechanisms in motion that will take time. If I remove him abruptly, certain financial structures collapse in ways that create collateral damage for people who had nothing to do with this. And in the meantime, he knows you know. Yes. Which makes him more dangerous, not less. Which is why the security detail on your building remains. He looked at her directly. I told you I needed 2 days to do this correctly. This is correctly. It's not fast, it's not satisfying. But it protects you and Amara without creating a vacuum that becomes its own threat. Serena studied him across the kitchen. Amara was in the living room, the sound of her murmuring to herself over her toys carrying through the apartment. A continuous low narrative that toddlers maintained with objects and imaginary participants. Whole internal dramas conducted in the language of stuffed animals and plastic shapes. He's been advising you for 19 years, she said. Yes. And you didn't see it. The silence that followed was the particular kind that a person allows because they've decided a thing deserves to be sat in. No, he said. I didn't see it. Serena turned to the stove, picked up the ladle, stirred the soup that didn't need stirring because she needed something to do that wasn't looking at him while he said things she had waited 2 years to hear. You trusted him over me, she said. Not an accusation, a fact being placed on a surface where both of them could look at it. Yes. Evidence he fabricated. Evidence that anyone who actually knew me. She stopped, set the ladle down. I had been your wife for 4 years. 4 years. And documents that existed for less than a week were more credible to you than everything you knew about me. She heard him exhale behind her. I was afraid, he said. She turned around. I was afraid and I made it look like certainty. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. That's what I do. I take fear and I convert it into action, and I tell myself the action is rational. The evidence confirmed something I had been terrified of, that someone in my life was working against me. And once I decided you were the threat, everything I knew about you became evidence of how well you'd hidden it. He paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you chose to believe I was guilty because it was easier than being afraid. He didn't argue. The soup was still warm. The drawings were still on the refrigerator. From the living room, Amara's murmuring continued its gentle, oblivious narrative, and Serena thought about how her daughter had been conceived inside a marriage that was already being demolished from within by a man at a dinner table who smiled wide and warm and had never meant a single second of it. Quan is going to move again, she said, before your legal mechanisms finish. He's not going to sit in suspension and wait to be audited out of his position. I know. You need to be ready for that. I know. And I need to know, she said, meeting his eyes, that when he does, whatever you decide to do about it, my daughter's name stays out of it. Whatever world you're operating in, whatever you decide Quan deserves, Amara doesn't carry the weight of it. She doesn't grow up knowing her father's world ended a man. Something shifted very completely in his expression. Agreed, he said quietly. Amara appeared in this kitchen doorway at that moment, as children do at the least dramatically convenient times, dragging a stuffed elephant by one ear and looking between the two adults with the peaceful assessment of someone who found this configuration, mother and tall, serious man in the kitchen, entirely acceptable. Soup? She asked, looking at Serena. In a minute, baby. Amara turned and looked at Jae-hyun. You stay for soup? She asked him. The question hung in the kitchen air. Jae-hyun looked at Serena. The question underneath the question was obvious. Permission, or something more complicated than permission. The beginning of something that had no clean name yet and probably shouldn't. Serena looked at her daughter's face, which was both of theirs in the specific way that made the fact of their history impossible to sidestep, or simplify, or put in a box with a manageable label. Get your chair, she told Amara. Amara went to get her chair. And Kang Jae-hyun stood in Serena's kitchen, and something in his face changed in a way that was quiet and total, the way light changes in a room when the source shifts. Not dramatic, not announced, just suddenly different from what it had been a moment before. He stayed for soup. He helped wash the bowl afterward because Serena handed him the dish towel without asking, and he took it without comment, which was its own kind of negotiation and its own kind of territory crossed. He left at 8:30 when Amara's eyes were drooping over her elephant. And it was at 8:47, after Serena had put her daughter down and come back to the kitchen to lock the door, that her phone rang. Not a message, a call. Unknown number. She answered. The voice on the other end was Chairman Kwon Seung-tae. "Dr. Adebayo," he said, warm and careful, with the smile she could hear even through a phone line. "I think it's time we had a conversation without Jae-hyun between us. Don't you?" Her hand tightened on the phone. Outside, the plainclothes detail was still on the street. Inside, her daughter was asleep. Somewhere across the city, Jae-hyun was in transit, not yet knowing that the man he was carefully, structurally dismantling had just... Serena didn't answer immediately. She stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and listened to Kwon Seung-tae breathe on the other end of the line. Steady, unhurried, the breathing of a man who had made calls like this before and understood that the first person to fill silence lost something. She knew the tactic because she had watched Jae-hyun use it across boardroom tables during the 2 years she'd been allowed inside those rooms. Power spoke last. Power waited. She was not going to let this man think he was the only one who knew how to wait. "Chairman Kwon," she said finally. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that in a distant, clinical way. The same gratitude she felt when her hands stayed steady during a procedure that frightened her. "How did you get this number?" "You've been a physician for 8 years in this city." He said it pleasantly. "You're listed in 3 medical directories. Your hospital extension routes to a mobile after hours." A brief pause. "I'm not calling to threaten you, Dr. Adebayo. I want you to understand that immediately. This call is a courtesy." "Courtesy," she repeated. "Jae-hyun is angry right now. Angry men make decisions that damage everyone around them, including people they're trying to protect." His voice was smooth the way certain surfaces were smooth, not because they were soft, but because there was nothing for your hands to grip. "I've known him for 19 years. I've watched him burn things down in anger and spend years rebuilding them. I'd rather spare you from being caught in that fire. By calling me at 9 in the evening from a number I don't recognize. By being direct with you, woman to..." He caught himself. "Person to person, without lawyers and mediators and his strategist whispering in corners." A slight shift in tone, something underneath the pleasantness showing its edge. "He's going to use you, Dr. Adebayo. What you represent, the child, the narrative of the wronged wife. It's useful to him right now. It justifies a war against me that is actually about something else entirely." Serena moved to the kitchen table and sat down. Her free hand found the edge of the table and pressed flat against it, grounding. She did it in trauma bays when she needed to think through noise. "What's it actually about?" she said. "Control of the Eastern Distribution Network. 3 board seats he wants back. A vote happening in 6 weeks that Jae-hyun currently does not have the internal support to win." Kwon's voice was careful now, precise. "I made a mistake 2 years ago. I've acknowledged that to myself. What I did to you was wrong, and I would not make the same choice again. But Jae-hyun's current response is not about justice for you. It's about leverage. You are leverage, Dr. Adebayo. You and that child." Her jaw tightened. "I'm going to hang up now," she said. "The man he sent to intercept my contractor," Kwon said quickly, before she could move the phone from her ear. "Did Jae-hyun tell you who that man was?" She didn't answer. "His name is Park Sung-jin. He has worked for Jae-hyun for 11 years. He also, for the past 3 of those years, has been feeding information to the Black Vortex Syndicate." A pause that was perfectly timed. "Jae-hyun doesn't know. I do. And the man he trusted to intercept the contractor protecting his leverage..." Another pause. Let the contractor walk." The kitchen was very quiet. Serena heard Amara shift in her crib through the baby monitor on the counter. A small sound, a sigh. The unconscious repositioning of a child deep in uncomplicated sleep. "You're lying," she said. "Call Han Dae-seok," Kwon said. "Ask him where Park Sung-jin has been for the past 72 hours. Ask him why the contractor's phone went dark at the same time Park made contact. Ask him." A brief silence. "I'm not your enemy, Dr. Adebayo. I'm the only person in this situation who is telling you the truth about what you're standing in the middle of." The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she called Jae-hyun. It went to voicemail. She called Han. He answered on the 4th ring, and she could tell from the quality of the background sound that he was in a car and that the car was moving fast. "Park Sung-jin," she said. "Where is he?" 3 seconds of silence. Not the silence of someone composing an answer, the silence of someone who has just had a floor drop out from under them and is trying to determine how far the fall is. "How do you know that name?" Han said. "Kwon just called me. He says Park has been feeding information to Black Vortex for 3 years and that he let the contractor walk." Her voice was steady, and she hated how much effort that steadiness was costing her now. "Tell me that's not true." The sound of the car, traffic outside, Han's breathing, which was controlled in the specific way of a man containing something large. "We became aware of a discrepancy 4 hours ago," he said finally. "Han, we don't know the full scope yet." "Han," she pressed her palm harder against the table. "Is my daughter safe right now?" "The detail on your building is solid. Those men are vetted separately from Park's chain. They have no connection to is she safe?" "Yes." His voice dropped to something direct and stripped of its professional evenness. "Yes. Right now she is safe. But Dr. Adebayo, you need to listen to me. If Kwon knows about Park, and Kwon is calling you directly, then the situation has moved faster than we anticipated, and you need to not be in that apartment tonight." The baby monitor. Amara's breathing, even and slow. "Where is Jae-hyun?" she said. "I'm trying to reach him. He went dark 40 minutes ago, which is protocol when he's in certain kinds of meetings, but given what—" A sound in the background. Han's voice moved away from the phone briefly, sharp and quiet in a way she couldn't parse. Then back. "Dr. Adebayo, pack what you need for 2 days, you and Amara. The detail will move you to a secured location within the hour. I'm not going anywhere until I know where Jae-hyun is." "That is not. He went dark in the middle of dismantling the man who just called me from a burner phone to tell me his own operative is compromised. Those two things are connected. Tell me where he is." A longer silence this time. "Gangnam Financial District," Han said quietly. "He went to meet with Kwon's attorney to deliver the formal suspension documentation. In person, which was not the plan." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something controlled and careful that was actually fear wearing a professional disguise. "He changed the plan without telling me." Serena was already standing. She moved to Amar's room and looked at her daughter in the crib. The spread arms, the elephant tucked under one elbow, the absolute innocence of a child who did not know that the city around her was currently reorganizing itself into something dangerous. She stood there for 4 seconds, which was all she permitted herself. Then she went to the closet and pulled out the go bag she had packed 6 days ago when the first message came through, because she was a woman who had learned the hard way that preparation was the only form of control she could actually trust. She called Han back. "The secured location," she said. "My aunt comes with us." "Understood. And you find him. You find him in the next 30 minutes, or I start making calls myself. And I promise you I still have contact information for 3 journalists who cover organized crime in this city, and I have never once in 2 years given them a single word." A beat. "I'll find him." She woke Aunt Blessing with a knock and 2 sentences. Her aunt, who had survived things in Lagos that Serena had only heard pieces of, asked 0 questions and was packed in 7 minutes. The detail moved them at 10:43. The secured location was a nondescript apartment in Mapogu, the kind of place that existed in a building of identical doors, that had furniture selected for function rather than personality, that smelled of fresh paint and nothing else. Amara slept through the transfer and woke briefly in the new crib, a portable one that had appeared in the apartment already assembled, which told Serena this location had been prepared in advance, which told her Han had anticipated this possibility before tonight, which meant the situation had been worse than she'd been told. She sat that feeling in a corner of her mind where she would deal with it later. Aunt Blessing made tea on the unfamiliar stove without being asked and set a cup in front of Serena and sat across from her and said nothing, which was the precise thing Serena needed from another human being in that moment. Jae-hyun arrived at 12:17 in the morning. She heard him before she saw him. His voice in the corridor outside, low and clipped, Han's voice responding, the particular sound of 2 people conducting a rapid damage assessment. Then the door opened. He looked at her first. Before he looked at anything else in the room, he looked at her. and she understood from the quality of that look that whatever the past 3 hours had contained, part of him had been conducting a parallel calculation about where she was and whether she was intact. Then he saw Aunt Blessing at the table, and something in his face adjusted. "Sit down," Serena said. "I need to—" "Sit down, Jae-hyun." He sat. Han remained near the door, hands clasped, face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who had already delivered bad news tonight and knew more was coming. "Park Sung-jin," Serena said. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened. "We're handling—" "That's the second time tonight someone has told me something is being handled, and I'm sitting in a safe house at midnight. So let's try something different." She kept her voice even, quiet. The quieter she spoke, the more he would have to lean in to hear her, and she wanted him leaning in. "Tell me what happened at the attorney's office." A long beat. "It was a setup," he said. "Kwan's attorney. Wasn't Kwan's attorney." He exhaled through his nose. "The meeting was arranged through a channel I trusted. The man I met was not an attorney. He was an intermediary for Black Vortex." He paused. "They've been in communication with Kwan for longer than we knew. This isn't a recent alliance. This goes back." His voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. Not anger, not the controlled ferocity she associated with him under pressure. Something raw, something that sounded almost like being caught without the armor on. 2 years, at minimum. Serena looked at him. 2 years, she said slowly. "While I was pregnant, while I was building a life alone with your daughter, Kwan was already working with the organization that is now threatening her." "Yes." "And the fabricated evidence against me was constructed with Black Vortex resources." His voice was flat and final, and it cost him something to say it that flatly. "Kwan provided the strategy. They provided the infrastructure, the digital forensics, the document fabrication, the witnesses who could be produced if I asked for verification." He pressed 2 fingers against the corner of his mouth, the gesture she remembered, the one that meant he was holding something back that wanted to come out wrong. "I didn't just trust forged documents. I trusted a conspiracy that had the resources of 2 organizations behind it." The apartment was very quiet. Aunt Blessing's tea was still steaming. From the back room, the faint sound of Amara's breathing through the monitor Han's team had set up within 20 minutes of their arrival, because these were people who thought about monitors and portable cribs and nondescript apartments in advance, and that fact, that readiness, told a story about the world Jae-hyun actually lived in that no amount of charcoal sweaters and picture books could entirely soften. "What did they want from you tonight?" Serena said. "To stand down." His hands were flat on the table. "To pull back the suspension, restore Kwan's position, let the internal audit disappear." A pause. "In exchange for a guarantee of safety. For me and Amara." "Yes." She looked at him across the table, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago and that she kept noticing and wishing she would stop noticing. At the particular set of his shoulders that she had learned over 4 years of marriage meant he was carrying something he hadn't yet decided how to put down. "And you said," he met her eyes. "I said no." Aunt Blessing made a small sound and picked up her tea. "You said no," Serena repeated, "to the people threatening your daughter, in a meeting you walked into alone without telling your strategist." "I said no," he confirmed. "And then I spent 2 hours in a room with 3 men I did not know while they explained in considerable detail what no would cost." Han shifted near the door. "What does no cost?" Serena said. "They'll move against the organization. They have enough internal intelligence between Kwan's position and Park's access to create significant structural damage." He was being precise in the way of someone selecting each word for its accuracy. "They will also—" He stopped. "They will use you and Amara as leverage, not harm. Leverage. Demonstrate that I can't protect the people I—" He stopped again. "That my protection is unreliable. To pressure you into standing down." "Yes." Serena stood up. She walked to the window. The blinds were down, a solid barrier of pale slats between the apartment and the city outside, and she stared at them without seeing them. Her reflection was faint in the dark gap at the edge of the frame. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been awake for 19 hours running calculations about her daughter's safety, and she was tired of looking like that. How long have you known about Park? She said without turning around. Silence. Han, she said. Han's voice was careful. We identified the discrepancy 4 days ago. She turned around. 4 days ago, she said. She looked at Jae Hyun. You knew 4 days ago that your security infrastructure was compromised and you continued supervised visitation on schedule. You came to my apartment for soup. You told me the situation was being handled. We didn't know the scope. You knew enough. Her voice was still quiet. The quietness was becoming something different now, something with a harder material underneath it. You made a decision about my risk level without giving me the information I needed to make my own decision. Again. She looked at him directly. You decided what I needed to know. Again. Jae Hyun. That is the exact mechanism that ended our marriage. The words landed. She watched them land, watched him absorb the specific, accurate shape of it. I know what you were trying to do. She picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She set it back down. You were trying to protect me by controlling my information, which is the same thing as not trusting me, which is the same thing that happened 2 years ago. The mechanism is identical. The intent is different and the mechanism is identical. Han was very still near the door. Jae Hyun's hands on the table had gone from flat to a loose fist that he then deliberately opened again. You're right, he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. I know I'm right, she said, but some of the heat had shifted. I'm telling you you're right, and it won't happen again. He looked at her steadily. Not as a promise that makes you feel better. As the only statement I can make that is actually accurate. A pause. What do you want to know? She looked at him for a long moment. All of it, she said. From the beginning of what you found 4 days ago to what happened in that room tonight. Everything. He told her. It took 40 minutes. Han filled in the sections where his own knowledge was more complete. Aunt Blessing refilled her tea and sat with the quiet patience of a woman who understood that some conversations needed a witness who would not interfere. Amara slept through all of it. When it was finished, Serena sat with the full shape of it for a moment. The conspiracy that had reached back 2 years. The internal rot that had enabled it. Park's compromised access. The Black Vortex timeline that put them in contact with Kwon before she had ever become a target, which meant she had been identified as a vulnerability, as the thing Jae Hyun might actually choose over strategy, before she had even known she was one. They chose me specifically, she said. Not another point of attack, me, because they'd assessed that I was the thing you wouldn't protect yourself against. Something moved through Jae Hyun's face. Yes, he said quietly. And they were right. She said it without judgment, a fact placed on a surface. If the evidence had been about someone else, a subordinate, a financial partner, you would have investigated before acting. But because it was me, because the possibility that I had betrayed you reached something you were already afraid of, you moved immediately. She paused. They understood you better than you understood yourself. He didn't answer. There was no answer for it. So here's where we are, she said. She stood up again because she needed to be standing for this part. Kwon is suspended but not gone. Park is compromised. Black Vortex has enough internal intelligence to create structural damage, and they've already demonstrated they're willing to use Amara as leverage. And the man I am supposed to be rebuilding a cautious, careful, supervised relationship with has just walked into an unsecured meeting alone and spent 2 hours being threatened. She looked at him. What is your actual plan? He was quiet for a moment, then, I need to remove Kwon completely. Tonight. Before morning. If he's still in a position to communicate with Black Vortex by sunrise, the leverage calculation changes. And Park. Contained. Han has 2 men on him. And the Black Vortex operatives already in motion. We have a window of approximately 4 hours before they receive confirmation that tonight's meeting didn't produce the result they wanted. After 4 hours, he paused. After 4 hours, the situation becomes significantly more active. 4 hours, Serena said. Yes. She looked at her aunt. Aunt Blessing was watching her with the specific expression she'd worn at pivotal moments throughout Serena's life. Not directing, not deciding for her, just witnessing with absolute attention and the particular steadiness of a woman who had stood in her own hard places and remained. Serena looked at the door to the back room where her daughter was sleeping. What do you need from me? She said. Jae-hyun looked at her carefully. Stay here. Keep Amara here. Let the detail do their work. That's not what I mean. She looked at him directly. Kwon called me tonight, directly. He told me things about Park before you did, which means he knows I'm an active participant in this situation, not a peripheral one. That makes me a resource. She paused. Or it makes me bait. The words sat in the room. Han made a small movement near the door that might have been the beginning of an objection. If Kwon believes he can use me to reach you, she said, then there's a version of tonight where that belief is turned around. She watched Jae-hyun's expression cycle through several things very rapidly, all of them controlled and none of them hidden from her the way they used to be, the way they had been for the last several years of their marriage, when she had started to feel the specific loneliness of living with a man who processed everything privately. I'm not asking you to put me in the field. I'm saying I received a call that you didn't. I have a direct line to Kwon that you don't. And I am not going to sit in this apartment for 4 hours while you go back out into a city full of people who have already demonstrated they'll reach through every boundary you think you've established. Serena, I'm not finished. She kept her eyes on him. 2 years ago, I had no information, no power, no position, and I lost everything anyway. I am not doing this the same way. If this goes wrong, if something happens tonight that changes the shape of Amara's life, I am not going to have sat in a safe house being protected while it happened. I'm going to have been part of the decision. Are we clear? The apartment was very still. Jae-hyun looked at her for a long moment. She could see him fighting the instinct, the deeply embedded, years-old reflex to contain the risk by containing her involvement, to protect by excluding, to love in the way of men who had learned love as a form of control so old they no longer felt the bars. What are you proposing? He said. She picked up her phone. She pulled up Kwon's number from her recent calls. I call him back, she said. I tell him I want to meet, that I've thought about what he said, and I think he's right that we should talk without Jae-hyun between us. She held the phone steadily. He'll agree. He thinks I'm afraid and isolated, and that tonight broke something between us. He'll agree, and he'll choose a location, and when he does, we know where he is, Han finished quietly from the door. And everything else follows from that, Serena said. She looked at Jae-hyun. He looked at the phone in her hand. If anything goes wrong, he started. Then we'll have made that decision together, she said, which is what you agreed to. The 4-hour window was already running. He nodded once. She dialed. Kwon answered on the second ring, and in the warmth of his voice she could hear exactly how certain he was that he had already won. That the night had broken the thing between her and Jae-hyun, that fear had done its work, that she was calling because she had finally understood that the safe choice was the one he was offering. Dr. Adebayo, he said, I'm glad you called. I want to meet, she said. Tonight, just us. A brief silence that she recognized as the pause of a man suppressing satisfaction. I know a place, he said. Across the table, Jae-hyun was already on his other phone, his voice barely above a murmur, and Han had moved to the window, and the 4 hours were running, and Serena sat in the safe house kitchen with her daughter asleep in the next room and the phone against her ear, and thought with cold clarity that she had spent 2 years being a woman. Things happened to, and that tonight that was going to... The location Kwon chose was a private dining room on the 14th floor of a building in Yeouido that belonged, on paper, to a hospitality investment group registered in the Cayman Islands. Serena knew this because Han told her in the car on the way there, speaking in the low, precise cadence of someone transmitting operational information to a civilian and choosing every word for its utility. The building had 2 exits beyond the main lobby. The private dining floor had its own elevator requiring a key card. Kwon's people would be on the floor before she arrived. She would be walking into a controlled environment with a controlled guest list, and the only variable Kwon hadn't fully accounted for was the 4-person team Han had positioned in the building across the street 40 minutes before her call had even ended. He'll search you, Han said. I know. No wire. No device. Nothing he can find. I know. She looked out the window at the Han River passing on their left, black and wide, catching the city lights in long, broken streaks. What's the signal? Say you need water, the word specifically, not something to drink. Water. She nodded. And if the situation deteriorates before you can signal, then you come in anyway. Yes. A pause. Dr. Adebayo, you don't have to. Don't. She said it without heat. Don't give me the exit now. We're 4 minutes out. Han was quiet. She looked at her own hands in her lap, steady. She needed them to stay that way. She thought about Amara, not as a motivating thought, not as something to reach toward. She had been a physician long enough to know that thinking about the thing you were protecting in the middle of a procedure was how you lost the procedure. She put her daughter in a sealed room at the back of her mind and locked the door, and she would not open it again until this was finished. The car stopped. Jae-hyun, she said. Han looked at her. Where is he? A beat. Parallel track. Different location. His voice was careful. Kwon isn't the only piece of this that needs to be resolved tonight. She understood. She didn't ask further. She got out of the car. The lobby of the building was the kind of marble and glass that announced money without specifying what kind. A man she didn't know was waiting at the elevator. Late 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing the particular blankness of professional security. He looked at her with the specific assessment of someone checking for threat indicators and finding a woman in dark clothes with a medical posture and steady hands. He gestured to the elevator. She stepped in. The 14th floor opened into a corridor, lined with pale wood paneling and the kind of ambient light that cost money to calibrate. The private dining room was at the end of the corridor. She could see warm light through the gap in the door, smell something that might have been coffee. Another man outside the door. Younger. He patted her down with professional efficiency and found nothing because there was nothing to find. He opened the door. Kwon Sung-tae was sitting at a round table set for two, coffee in front of him, jacket off, looking for all the world like a man who had arranged a late business dinner with a colleague. He was 61 years old, and he looked like someone's distinguished grandfather, which she now understood was the most dangerous thing about him. Dr. Adebayo, he stood, gestured to the chair across from him. Please. She sat. She kept her hands visible on the table. She kept her breathing even. She kept her eyes on him with the specific quality of attention she gave to patients who were lying to her about their symptoms. Surface engagement, everything underneath tracking. You came alone, he said. You said without Jae-hyun between us. I did. He settled back in his chair, studied her. You look calmer than I expected. I'm a trauma physician. Calm is a professional requirement. Something moved in his expression. Appreciation, maybe, or the recalibration of an assessment. Then let me be direct with you. I respect your time. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Jae-hyun is going to lose. I want you to understand that clearly before you make any further decisions about which side of this you're standing on. The internal vote in 6 weeks. He doesn't have the numbers. The structural damage I can cause to his operations over the next 30 days will make it impossible for him to recover those numbers. The black vortex alignment gives me resources he can't match right now. He met her eyes. He's going to lose. And when he does, the question becomes what happens to you and your daughter in the aftermath. Serena looked at him. You're telling me to switch sides, she said. I'm telling you to think clearly. He set the cup down. You don't owe him loyalty. He divorced you on fabricated evidence. Evidence I provided, yes, and I've acknowledged that was a serious wrong. But he believed it. He signed the papers. He had you removed from your home. A pause. I'm offering you a guaranteed position regardless of how this resolves. Financial security. Protection for your daughter. An arrangement that does not depend on Jae-hyun winning a fight he is currently losing. The room was very quiet. Serena looked at the man who had dismantled her life with 19 years of Jae-hyun's trust and the resources of an organization she'd never known existed, and the specific coldness of someone who viewed other people as variables in equations that only ever solved for his own outcome. Can I have some water? She said. He blinked, looked at his security man near the wall, and tilted his head. The man moved to the credenza. Serena kept her eyes on Kwon. I've thought about your offer, she said. Her voice was even, and she was counting backward from 10 in the back of her mind, the way she counted during procedures when the margin for error collapsed to nothing. And? I think you've misunderstood what I am to the situation. She picked up the water glass when it arrived and set it down without drinking. You looked at me and saw a leverage point, something soft that could be pressed to produce results. That's how you've been operating since the gala. She kept her hands loose on the table. You've been running the wrong analysis. Kwan's eyes narrowed. The door came open. Not the corridor door, the service entrance at the back of the room. The one she hadn't known about until Han had told her in the car, because Han's team had spent 40 minutes in this building memorizing its architecture. Two men came through it fast, and the security by the wall moved but not fast enough, and the corridor door opened simultaneously, and the man who had escorted her from the elevator was suddenly no longer a factor. Kwan was on his feet. He looked at Serena. "You!" "I told you," she said. "Wrong analysis." Han came through the corridor door last, unhurried, and looked at Kwan across the room with the expression of a man completing a task that had been on his list for a while. Kwan looked at the room, looked at the exits that were no longer exits, looked at Serena, who had not moved from her chair. Something cycled through his face, the rapid recalculation of a man who had spent 19 years being the one who arranged rooms and was now standing in one he hadn't arranged. "Where's Jae-hyun?" he said. "Somewhere else," Han said. "Dealing with the parallel problem. Park has been in a room with my people since 11:43. Han's voice was the same as always, while level, precise, with the economy of someone who had never needed volume to carry weight. "The Black Vortex operatives your attorney contacted this morning have been intercepted at 2 separate locations. The vote in 6 weeks has already shifted. 3 board members who were in your column made calls in the last 2 hours that suggest their positions are reconsidering." He paused. "It's done, Chairman." Kwan stood very still. Then he looked at Serena. "You called me," he said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite disbelief, more like the specific confusion of someone reassessing an earlier certainty. "You called me and set this up." "I called you," she confirmed. "And I sat in this room and let you explain your offer so that Han's team could confirm your direct connection to Black Vortex on record. The conversation in this room is documented." She kept her voice completely flat. "You told me tonight that you were aligned with the organization threatening my daughter. You told me directly, and I made sure there were people listening." Kwan's jaw worked. "You're a doctor," he said. It came out strange, Doc. Not an accusation, more like a man discovering that a tool he'd been using had been something else entirely. "Yes," she said. "I also spent 2 years learning exactly what you did to my life. And I am very good at keeping things steady when everything is on fire." She stood up. She picked up the glass of water she hadn't drunk and set it back on the credenza and looked at Han. "I need a car," she said. "I need to get back to my daughter." 2 minutes, Han said. Kwan was still standing in the center of the room. He had not been touched. He had not been threatened in any way that would constitute a legal problem. He had been walked into a documentation exercise by a woman he had assessed as the soft point in the situation, which was, Serena thought, exactly the kind of mistake men like him made about women like her. She walked to the door. "Dr. Adebayo." She stopped, didn't turn. "He doesn't deserve you," Kwan said. It came out quiet and stripped of its earlier smoothness, something underneath it that might have been genuine. "Whatever happens from here, he didn't deserve you 2 years ago either." She stood with her hand on the door frame. "No," she said. "He didn't." She left. The car was waiting in the basement. She got in. The city moved past the windows in the specific way it moved at 1 in the morning. Thinner than its daytime self, the bones of it more visible. Light scattered across the dark, like evidence of all the things happening simultaneously in spaces she couldn't see. Her phone buzzed. Jae-hyun. She answered. "Done," he said. His voice was rough in a way that told her the parallel track had been less clean than Han's operation. "Are you hurt?" A pause that told her everything. "Jae-hyun. I'm functional." The word was chosen with the care of someone in pain, selecting terminology that is technically accurate. "It's handled. Park is contained. The Black Vortex point of contact has been..." A breath. "It's handled. Where are you?" "Gangnam. I'll have the detail bring me to you." "I'm going back to Amara first." "I know." A pause. "Serena." "What?" The documentation from the dining room. When Han sends it to Min-ji, I want it filed simultaneously with the prosecutor's office. Kwon protected himself inside the organization for 19 years. I want the legal mechanism to run parallel to the internal one. She looked out the window. That exposes you, she said. I know. Filing with the prosecutor's office means your organization becomes visible in ways that I know what it means. She was quiet for a moment. We talk about it first, she said, before anything is filed, together. Together, he said. Yes. She heard him exhale. She heard, in the exhale, a man at the outer edge of what he could hold at once. The physical cost of whatever had happened on the parallel track, the internal cost of a 19-year alliance detonating in real time, the particular vertigo of a person who has spent decades operating as the final word on everything, now navigating a situation where someone else's voice carries equal weight. She heard all of that in one exhale, and she didn't comment on it. Get a doctor to look at whatever happened to you, she said. I'm a doctor. Get a doctor to look at it. That's not a suggestion. A beat. All right, she hung up. The car reached the building in Mapo-gu. Aunt Blessing was awake at the kitchen table, tea in hand, and she looked at Serena come through the door and did the specific rapid assessment that people who love you do when you've been somewhere dangerous, scanning, reading, determining the category of what they're seeing. She slept through everything, Aunt Blessing said. Good. You look like you've been through a fire. I'm fine. Serena set her jacket on the chair and went to the door of the back room and eased it open. Amara was exactly where she'd been. Arms spread, elephant tucked under one elbow, face completely slack in the way of a child who had no reason to be anything but at peace. Serena stood in the doorway for a long time. The adrenaline was leaving her system in the slow, exhausting way it always did. Not a crash exactly, more like a tide going out, taking with it the specific sharpness that had kept her clear-eyed and precise in that dining room and leaving behind something much less manageable. She was shaking, not visibly, not in any way that showed. Inside, where the steady hands and the even voice couldn't reach, inside she was shaking the way a structure shakes after the force passes through it, all the absorbed impact finally acknowledged. She closed the door carefully. She sat down in the kitchen chair across from Aunt Blessing and put both hands flat on the table. Her aunt set a cup of tea in front of her. Neither of them spoke. Serena drank the tea in small controlled sips and stared at a fixed point on the kitchen wall and let the shaking run its course. 15 minutes. That was all she would permit it. 15 minutes, and then she would think clearly about the next 12 hours. The legal filings, the internal vote, the Black Vortex operatives still at large, the conversation she still needed to have with Jae-hyun about what filing with the prosecutor's office actually meant for all of them. Her phone buzzed. Han. Kwon en route to secure holding. Documentation transmitted to Min-ji. Parallel track complete. 3 injuries, none critical. Mr. Kang is en route to your location. ETA 22 minutes. She read it twice. She put the phone down. 3 injuries, none critical. She would look at him when he arrived and she would know immediately what none critical meant in the specific language of men who understated physical damage as a professional habit. She would look at his face and his hands and the way he held himself and she would know. 22 minutes. She picked up the tea. She thought about the moment in the dining room when she had said wrong analysis to a man who had spent decades being right about everything. She thought about his face when Han came through the service door. Not fear exactly, but the specific expression of a man discovering that the board he thought he was playing on was larger than he'd seen, that there were pieces he hadn't accounted for, that one of them had been sitting across the table from him the entire time. She thought about what Jae-hyun had said, the documentation, the prosecutor's office, exposing the organization in ways that would take years to navigate and would fundamentally change what his operation looked like on the other side. He had suggested it, not as a gambit, not as a strategic concession. He had suggested it with the particular tone of a man who had decided something about what his life needed to look like from a certain point forward and was beginning to work backward from that decision to the actions it required. She understood what it would cost him. She wasn't sure she was ready to know what she felt about the fact that he was prepared to pay it. The door of the apartment opened at 1:47 in the morning. Jae-hyun came in. She looked at him. He was holding his left side in the specific way of someone managing a rib injury. Not clutching, not dramatic, just the unconscious adjustment of a person keeping a painful thing stable. There was a cut above his right eyebrow that had been closed with what looked like field dressing, the tape slightly crooked in the way of self-applied work. His jacket was gone. His shirt had a dark stain on the left sleeve that she was going to assess and then do something about regardless of what he said. He looked at her across the small apartment kitchen. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the mediation corridor when he'd said please, with the face underneath the face, the one she'd stopped believing she'd ever see again. "Amara," he said. "Sleeping." She stood up. "Sit down." "I don't need—" "Jae Hyun." She was already moving to the cabinet where Han's team had stocked basic medical supplies, because of course they had. "Sit down." He sat. She worked quickly and without narrating what she was doing, the way she worked in trauma bays. The rib was bruised, possibly cracked. She palpated carefully, and he absorbed the discomfort without comment, except for a single sharp intake of breath at the third intercostal space. The arm was a laceration, clean-edged, already clotting. She cleaned it and closed it with steri strips and covered it without asking how it had happened. He watched her work. She could feel him watching her work. "You were right," he said, "in the safe house. About the information I withheld." "I know I was right." She pressed the last strip flat. "We're not doing this tonight. I need to say it." "You said it in the safe house. I need to say the rest of it." His voice was low and direct, and she stilled her hands without stepping back. "I've been trying to protect you in the way that I know how, which is by controlling the variables around you. And every time I do that, I'm making the same decision. That my judgment about your safety supersedes your right to know what you're standing in the middle of." He paused. "I know how to run an organization. I know how to manage threat and counter-threat, and the specific calculus of when to move and when to wait. I don't know how to—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to be in something with another person without converting it into a structure I control. And I know that's what ended us. I know that's what Kwon counted on. And I know that tonight you sat in a room with him and did what I couldn't do, which was let him believe he was winning long enough to be wrong." He looked at her directly. "I would not have let you do that if you hadn't made me agree first. I would have tried to keep you out of it, and we would have lost." The apartment was very still. Aunt Blessing had, at some point, quietly taken her tea to the back room. Serena stood in front of the man who had been her husband, who had broken everything between them with a mechanism so embedded in his nature that he hadn't seen he was using it, who had spent the past weeks sitting on activity room floors and reading books about frogs and holding a small girl still enough not to wake her. And she thought about the prosecutor's office, and the organization, and the vote in 6 weeks, and all the structural reality of what the next year of their lives was going to look like. And she thought about Amara pointing across a ballroom with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who simply knew what she knew. "The prosecutor's office," she said. "Yes. If you file, the organization faces scrutiny that could take years to resolve." "Yes. You could lose significant operational—" "Yes." He didn't look away. "I know what it cost." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because Kwon was right about one thing," he said. "As long as I am what I am, you and Amara will never be fully safe. Every enemy I make is a calculation someone runs about what I value. And I cannot—" His voice dropped to something barely above a murmur. "I will not have my daughter grow up as a variable in someone else's threat assessment." The words sat in the air between them. Outside the apartment, Seoul was still moving. Traffic and light, and the continuous unnamed activity of a city that never entirely slept. Inside, Amara was breathing in even measures in the back room, and Serena was standing in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with steri strips on her fingers and the full weight of the next decision pressing down on her chest like something she could either push against, or finally, she let out a breath she had been holding for 2 years. Not literally, not in any single exhalation that she could point to and say, "There, that was the moment." It happened the way most real things happened, gradually and then all at once. The way a fracture propagates through material under sustained pressure until the structure finally decides what it's going to be. "Okay," she said. Jae-hyun looked at her. "Not okay as in, I forgive everything," she said. She was still standing, She needed to still be standing for this. Okay, as in, I hear what you're saying, and I believe you mean it, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter to me, because it does, and lying about it serves no one. She held his gaze. But meaning it and doing it are different things. You've been meaning things your whole life. The doing is what we don't have a record of yet. I know. So we build the record. She sat down across from him. The kitchen table between them, the same surface they'd been navigating across for weeks. Mediation tables, conference tables, this borrowed table in a safe house apartment that smelled of fresh paint. The prosecutor's office. We talk to Minji tomorrow. Both of us in the room. We don't move on anything until I understand every consequence and I agree to every consequence. Agreed. And Amara's visitation, the supervised arrangement stays until there's enough record built that I can trust the consistency. Not because I doubt what you're feeling right now, because feelings at 2 a.m. after a crisis are not the same thing as a Tuesday afternoon 6 months from now when the crisis has faded and something else is pulling at your attention. Something moved through his expression at that. Not offense. Recognition. Agreed, he said again. And you tell me things. She put her hands flat on the table between them. Not everything. I'm not asking for operational transparency into decisions that don't concern me. But anything that touches my life or Amar's life, you tell me before you decide. Not after. Not when the situation is already developed. Before. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him feeling the specific weight of that commitment. The man who had spent decades operating as the final authority on everything being asked to share the threshold of decisions before he'd finished making them. It was not a small thing. She knew it wasn't a small thing, and she asked for it anyway because it was the thing that mattered. Before, he said. Then we build the record, she said, and we see what it looks like. She got up and went to bed. He slept on the couch. She knew because she checked at 3:40 in the morning when Amara made a sound that turned out to be nothing, and she looked into the living room on her way back and he was there, jacket folded under his head, long frame not quite fitting the length of the cushions, already asleep with the specific totality of someone whose body had finally enforced what their mind wouldn't consent to. She stood in the dark and looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to bed. The following 6 weeks were the most structurally complicated of Serena's adult life, which was a significant threshold given that the previous record had been set by a surprise pregnancy following an unexpected divorce. Minji filed the documentation with the prosecutor's office on a Thursday morning, with Serena and Jae-hyun both present, both having read every page, both having signed off on every disclosure. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Investigator Oh Soo-yeon, who had spent 11 years in financial crimes and who looked at the documentation with the specific quality of focus of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular door to open. This implicates your own operations, Oh Soo-yeon said to Jae-hyun across the table. Yes, he said. You understand what cooperation at this level means for the scope of the investigation. I've been advised extensively. He paused. I understand. Oh Soo-yeon looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at Serena. Then she looked back at the documentation. I'll need 3 days to assess the full scope, she said. Don't leave the city. Kwon Sung-tae was formally charged 18 days later. The charges were specific and well documented and included evidence that reached back considerably further than the fabrication of evidence against Serena, a pattern of manipulation and financial misconduct spanning nearly a decade. The Black Vortex Alliance, representing only the most recent and most dangerous iteration of a long practice of building personal leverage at the organization's expense. Park Sung-jin cooperated in exchange for a reduced arrangement. His testimony filled in sections of the timeline that the documentation alone couldn't reach. The internal vote happened on a Tuesday. Jae-hyun lost 3 board seats. He also, in the same session, presented a restructuring proposal that transferred significant operational authority to a new oversight structure. Not dissolution, not surrender, but a fundamental change in how the organization governed itself that removed the single authority model that had made someone like Kwon possible in the first place. Some people called it weakness. Han told her this on a phone call, 2 days after the vote, with the neutral tone of someone reporting information without endorsing the interpretation. What does he call it? She asked. A pause. Necessary, Han said. She sat with that for a moment. How is he? She said. Another pause. This one different. The pause of a man who was close enough to the subject to have an actual answer and was deciding how much of it to give. He's sleeping less than he should. He's eating adequately. He goes to the gym at 5 in the morning, which I think is less about fitness and more about having somewhere to put things. A beat. He asks about Amara every day, sometimes twice. I know, she said. He texts me. I know, Han said. He asks me to confirm that texting is appropriate before he does it. She almost laughed. The almost surprised her. Tell him it's appropriate, she said. I will, Han said. The supervised visitation continued. Tuesdays and Thursdays. The Family Mediation Center with its rotating toy basket and its institutional ambient light and the supervisor near the window with a tablet. Jae-hyun arrived on time every session, without exception. He never brought gifts that were too large or gestures that were too elaborate. He learned quickly that Amara's economy of trust was built on presence, not presentation. She didn't care about toys. She cared about whether you were there and whether you paid attention and whether you remembered that her elephant was named Boo and not to call it anything else. He remembered. He remembered everything she told him, which Serena noticed because she was watching closely, which was her right and her job, and also, if she was being honest with herself in the 3 a.m. honesty of her kitchen, something that was becoming increasingly difficult to do with the purely clinical detachment she had initially managed. The first crack had appeared in the mediation center on a Thursday in November. Amara had been working on a puzzle, a wooden one with large pieces shaped like animals, the kind designed for children slightly younger than her but beloved nonetheless. And she had gotten stuck on the giraffe piece, which didn't fit where she was certain it should fit, and she had been struggling with it for 3 minutes with increasing frustration, and then Jae-hyun had reached over and rotated the piece 45 degrees without a word, and it clicked into place. Amara had looked at it. Then she had looked at him. Then she had gone back to the puzzle with the equanimity of a child who had simply received assistance with a technical problem. But she had leaned slightly into his side as she worked, just slightly. The unconscious lean of a small person who had decided that another person was a structure worth resting against. Serena had been standing near the door and she had seen it, and she had felt something move through her chest that she had subsequently taken home and spent 4 days not examining and then examined anyway, alone, at midnight, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had learned that unexamined things had a way of deciding their own outcomes. The second crack appeared at a park in early December, a Saturday, not a scheduled visit, but Jae-hyun had asked, through the appropriate channel, whether a park visit might be arranged with the supervisor present, and Min-ji had approved it, and so there they were in the thin winter sunlight with Amara in her red coat running at the specific reckless velocity of a 2-year-old who did not believe in physics. She fell. It was a small fall. A stumble over her own feet, which happened constantly at this age, the body perpetually outrunning the coordination available to manage it. She went down on her hands and one knee on the paved path, and there was a moment, that suspended moment before the assessment of damage produces the appropriate response, where she sat on the ground and looked at her hands. Then her lower lip went. She raised her face and she was looking for someone to run to, and her eyes found Jae-hyun first. He was closer, or maybe she found him first for reasons neither of them could have articulated. And she said it. Daddy. Not as an address, not as a considered label. The way children say the words that matter to them, without preamble or qualification, a simple declaration of the world as they found it. Jae-hyun reached her in 3 strides and picked her up, and she cried into his shoulder for approximately 90 seconds, which was the full emotional budget she had allocated for the incident, and then she wanted down again because there were pigeons near the bench, and pigeons were significantly more interesting than a scraped knee. Serena had stood on the path and watched this and felt the second crack go all the way through. She didn't say anything about it, not that day. But that night she called her mother in Lagos for the first time in 6 months, and her mother asked how things were going, and Serena said complicated. And her mother said complicated is just the word people use for things that matter, which was the kind of thing her mother said that was either profoundly wise or exactly what Serena didn't want to hear, and probably both simultaneously. She called Jae-hyun 2 days later, not through lawyers, not through Min-ji, his number directly, which she still had because she had never deleted it because deleting it had felt like a permanence she hadn't been ready to name. He answered on the second ring. The restaurant, she said. A pause. What restaurant? Aunt Blessing has a lease option on the ground floor of her building. The space next door is coming available. She's been thinking about expanding. Serena looked at the wall of her kitchen. I was thinking about something different. A longer pause. Tell me, he said. Something that isn't either of ours, she said carefully. Not your money, not my space, not a gesture from you toward me or me toward you. Something we build from an equal starting point. Something Amara can grow up knowing is hers, too. She paused. Korean and West African food. There are maybe 3 places in Seoul trying that combination, and none of them are doing it well. She could hear him breathing on the other end. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since the safe house, roughly. That was 6 weeks ago. I think slowly about the things that matter. She paused. I'm not suggesting we live in the same house. I'm not suggesting we renegotiate what we are to each other tonight. I'm suggesting a shared project with a shared stake and shared decisions, a record-building exercise. She let that land, with better food than that mediation center coffee. He was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. I don't know anything about running a restaurant, he said finally. I don't either. Aunt Blessing does. She paused. You'd have to work with her. Is that a warning? Aunt Blessing will tell you exactly what she thinks of you at all times, in 3 languages without being asked. So yes, it's a warning. Something moved in his voice. Not quite a laugh, the shape of one. All right, he said. All right, she said. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table. Outside the window, the street was doing what streets did in December. People moving through the cold with their shoulders up, breath visible in the air, the particular purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be and were focused on getting there. She watched it for a while. Then she got up and started writing down everything she knew about the space next door to Aunt Blessing's restaurant. The build-out took 4 months. There were arguments, real ones, about the kitchen layout, about the menu scope, about whether the dining room should seat 40 or 60, about the name, about the hours, about the financial structure of the partnership. Aunt Blessing won approximately 60% of the arguments, which Serena thought was fair because she was the only one who actually knew what she was doing. Jaehyun lost arguments with the particular quality of a man relearning how to lose things without it constituting a crisis, which was, Serena observed, happening with increasing ease as the months moved forward. He also showed up. Every day the build-out needed something, he showed up. Not with money. The terms of the partnership were deliberately structured to prevent either of them from having a financial leverage position over the other. Minji's work, meticulous and impervious. He showed up with hours. He learned how Aunt Blessing took her tea. He learned which suppliers she trusted and which ones she thought were cutting corners on produce. He learned that she would test him periodically with small, incorrect statements about ingredients, and that the correct response was to look it up rather than defer. Because deferring to someone who was wrong was, in Aunt Blessing's framework, a form of disrespect masquerading as politeness. He passed the tests. Aunt Blessing mentioned this to Serena once, briefly, while they were reviewing the menu proofs. She said, he learns fast, and returned to the proofs without further comment, which from Aunt Blessing was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The supervised visitation had been formally restructured in February, so longer sessions, unsupervised park visits twice monthly, a standing Tuesday dinner arrangement at a family-approved location that had organically become Aunt Blessing's restaurant before the new place opened, because Amara liked the agusi soup and had developed the specific tyranny of children about preferred foods. Amara was 2.5 now. Her vocabulary had expanded to somewhere in the range of 300 words, and she deployed them with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was focused on obtaining it. She called Jaehyun Daddy with the same uncomplicated consistency with which she called Serena Mama. Not a statement, not a demand, just the settled nomenclature of her world. She also, one Tuesday in March, told him that he needed a haircut. He came to Serena that evening with the particular expression of a man who has just been instructed on his appearance by a small person and is not sure how to categorize the experience. She's not wrong, Serena said. He got the haircut. The restaurant opened on a Thursday in April, which Aunt Blessing had determined was the most auspicious day of the week for beginnings, on the grounds that it was close enough to the weekend to catch early energy, but far enough from Monday to avoid leftover weekday grimness. Serena had not argued with this. The space was warm. That was the thing she noticed first on opening day. Not the design choices she and Jae-hyun and Aunt Blessing had argued over for months. Not the hand-lettered menus or the photographs on the walls that blended images of Korean markets and Lagos streets into something that was neither and both. Just the warmth, the way it held people, the way voices bounced off the walls with a softness that made conversation feel private even when the room was full. They served 53 covers on opening night. Aunt Blessing moved through the dining room like someone in her natural environment, which she was. Jae-hyun worked the floor with the focused adaptability of a man who had spent his career reading rooms and was discovering that this particular skill translated across contexts in ways he hadn't anticipated. Serena ran the coordination between kitchen and floor because she was, it turned out, the one with the highest tolerance for managing simultaneous moving parts without losing the thread, a fact she attributed to 13 years of emergency medicine, and that Jae-hyun attributed carefully and once to the specific kind of strength that had kept her standing through the years she'd spent standing alone. She had let that land without correcting it, because it was true, and because there was a version of truth that didn't need to be complicated. Late in the evening, when the last covers had been cleared and Aunt Blessing was in the kitchen directing the close down with the focused authority she brought to all things, Serena stood near the window that looked out onto the street and the river beyond it, the Han catching the last of the evening light in the particular way it did in April, softer than winter, not yet the full warm gold of summer, something in between. She heard Amara before she saw her. The little girl came out of the back room where she'd been set up with a blanket and her elephant and a selection of books that were supposed to keep her occupied through the dinner service and had apparently reached their limit of her attention. She was dragging Boo by the ear and surveying the now quiet dining room with the proprietary air of someone assessing her domain. She walked to where Jae-hyun was stacking chairs at one of the side tables. She tapped his leg. He looked down. She held Boo up. "Boo is tired," she said. "It's been a long night," he agreed. "We should go home," she said. She said it with the settled certainty of a statement about a fact, not a request. Jae-hyun looked across the dining room at Serena. Serena looked at her daughter, at the small, serious face, the elephant, the red socks she'd insisted on wearing, despite Serena's suggestion that socks and sandals were not a winning combination. At the way she stood between them in the warm room with the same uncomplicated confidence with which she had pointed across a ballroom 7 months ago, operating on the simple child's logic that the people who mattered to her should be in the same place. "We should go home." Not which home. Not a request for clarification on the domestic geography. Just the word home as a category that included all three of them, self-evidently, without needing to be argued into existence. Serena looked at Jae-hyun. He was still looking at her. His face in the low, warm light of the restaurant they had built together over 4 months of arguments and small decisions, and the kind of accumulated shared investment that built something sturdier than either of them had managed to build the first time, when they were younger and less broken and had not yet learned what it actually cost to lose each other. She thought about the ballroom, the chandelier light, the 6 words that had stopped the room, the small hand pointing. She thought about the corridor after, the word please, in a voice that didn't know how to say it. She thought about mediation rooms and fluorescent lights, and a man sitting cross-legged on an activity mat because his daughter's eye level was the only level that mattered. She thought about a safe house kitchen at midnight, a dining room in Yoido, the prosecutor's office on a Thursday morning, 4 months of kitchen layout arguments and menu proofs, and a man learning the correct response when Aunt Blessing told him something incorrect about ginger. She thought about all of it the way you think about a road you've traveled, not the individual steps, but the shape of the whole distance, how far the start was from where you were standing now. "We should go home," she said. Jae-hyun set down the chair he was holding. He crossed the dining room. He stopped in front of her. Not too close, not the presumptuous proximity of a man who had decided the distance was already closed. He stopped where he always stopped now, the considered distance of a man who had learned at cost that the right to close the gap had to be given. She reached out and touched the scar above his right eyebrow, still faintly visible where the field dressing had been. She touched it with 2 fingertips, briefly, the way you touch a thing you want to confirm is real. His hand came up and covered hers, not holding, not gripping, just covering. She let him. They stood there for a moment in the empty restaurant, while Aunt Blessing's voice carried from the kitchen in the particular mix of Korean and Yoruba she used when she was satisfied with how things had gone. And Amara stood between them with her elephant and looked up at both of them with the patience of a child who had always known this was where the story was going. Outside, the Han River moved the way it always moved, patient and indifferent and continuous, carrying the city's light on its surface into the dark. Inside, Serena removed her hand from his face and picked up her daughter and settled her on her hip, and Amara rested her head on Serena's shoulder and pointed at Jae-hyun with one imperious finger. "Daddy carries Boo," she said. He took the elephant. They walked out together into the April night, and the door of the restaurant closed behind them, and the city continued its continuous life around them, ordinary and indifferent and alive. And there was nothing cinematic about it, nothing that announced itself as a moment worth marking. Just three people walking down a street in Seoul in the early warmth of spring, one of them carrying a stuffed elephant, none of them talking. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind you had to earn. It had cost them both everything to get here. 2 years of separate pain, months of careful reconstruction, one night of considerable danger, and the long, ordinary work of building a record that could be trusted. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy. There were things between them that would take more years to fully settle. Conversations they would return to and circle back around. Old wounds with the specific tenderness of injuries that healed imperfectly and needed to be treated with ongoing care. Jae-hyun Kang was not a different man than he had been. He was the same man, working with the same temperament, the same deep habits of control and privacy, and the instinct to convert love into management. He would get it wrong again. She knew this the way she knew her own patterns, her tendency toward contained endurance, her instinct to solve rather than to grieve, the way she locked things in sealed rooms of her mind and came back to them on her own schedule. They were both going to get it wrong again. The difference was that they were going to get it wrong in the same room, with the same information. And with a 2.5-year-old who would continue to point at the truth with absolute, uncomplicated directness, regardless of how complex the adults around her made the process of acknowledging it. Amara had fallen half asleep by the time they reached the corner, her weight gone boneless the way it did when she gave up the fight against sleep mid-transit. Her small hand had found a grip on Serena's collar. Jae-hyun looked at her, and then at Serena. "I've got her," he said. She transferred the sleeping child into his arms. He took her without the early clumsiness now. The hands knew where to go, the arm curved to the right angle. Amara resettled without waking, turning her face into his shoulder. He looked down at his daughter. The expression on his face was one Serena had no word for in any language she spoke. It was not happiness, exactly. It was not relief or gratitude or love or any of the labeled things, though it contained all of them. It was something that came after all of those. When the storm had moved through and you were standing in the changed landscape, understanding for the first time what you'd actually been fighting for. She had seen that expression once before, in a hotel corridor 7 months ago, when a little girl had reached for him with both hands, and he had stood there holding her for the first time, understanding the full dimensions of what had been kept from him and what he had allowed to be taken. That was where it had started, not in the ballroom, not with the 6 words or the pointing finger or the silence that fell across 400 people, in the corridor, in the privacy of a moment no one else had seen. In the specific quality of a man's face when he is confronted with something so much larger than himself that all the structure he has spent a lifetime building suddenly looks like what it is: scaffolding, useful and necessary, and entirely beside the point. They walked the rest of the way in the quiet. The city around them. The April air with its particular character, neither warm nor cold, the exact temperature of something about to become something else. Amara slept in his arms all the way home. And Serena walked beside them and thought about the word home and what it meant when it stopped being a place and became a practice. When it stopped being something you had and became something you chose, repeatedly, with full knowledge of the cost, because the alternative was a kind of poverty that had nothing to do with money or square footage or what your address looked like on paper. She had built one home from wreckage. She was building another from something more durable, if less innocent. From the specific material of 2 people who had already survived the worst version of each other and had come back to the table anyway, who had a daughter between them who would grow up speaking 3 languages and eating a goosey soup and jjajangmyeon at the same table, and knowing that the adults who loved her were capable of catastrophic failure and also, eventually, of this, of a Tuesday night in April, of a sleeping child and an elephant named Boo, of the kind of quiet that costs everything and is worth it. The story did not end with anyone saved. It ended with everyone present, which was, in the end, the only version of the word home that had ever mattered.